On the peaceful planet of Zorath, an air of desperation filled the atmosphere. The aliens of Zorath, a species known for their peaceful ways, had always lived in harmony with their world. They were a gentle race, focusing on knowledge, art, and building strong bonds with nature. But now their way of life was in danger. A ruthless warlord from another galaxy, known as Korath, had set his sights on their planet. His army, composed of vicious warriors and merciless machines, was advancing rapidly toward Zorath, destroying everything in its path. The Zorathians, once proud of their advanced technology and peaceful society, now found themselves helpless against Korath's violent forces. Their cities were crumbling, their people fleeing, and hope was slipping away. In the midst of the chaos, the leaders of Zorath gathered. They knew they had to act. The warlord's forces were far too powerful for them to defeat alone. They needed help, urgent help, from anyone who could turn the tide in their favor. The decision was made. A message was broadcast across the stars, a desperate plea for aid to any advanced civilization that might hear it. The Zorathians had heard rumors of a fierce and unstoppable race, known as the Deathworlders. Legend said that these warriors were as deadly as they were powerful, their ships massive and their battle strategies brutal. But the Zorathians had no choice. Their message was clear. We need help. Our world is dying. Please, come to our aid. As the transmission sent out into the void of space, the Zorathians anxiously awaited a response. Days passed with no reply. The alien leaders began to doubt if anyone would come to their aid. The Zorathians had always been peaceful, and they had never experienced war like this before. Maybe no one cared. Maybe they had waited too long to call for help. But then, as their last remaining defenses crumbled and the planet's sky grew darker from the smoke of burning cities, something unexpected happened. The stars above flickered. A massive shape appeared on the horizon, blocking out the stars. It was enormous, larger than any ship the Zorathians had ever seen. It was not the type of ship they had expected. There was no peaceful envoy, no friendly visitors. The ship was a warship. It was shaped like a massive beast, its surface covered in battle scars from years of fighting. It was armed with weapons that seemed capable of destroying entire cities with a single blast. The Zorathians gasped as the ship descended toward the planet's surface. Was this the help they had called for? Was this their salvation? As the warship landed, its engines roared like a thunderstorm, shaking the ground beneath the Zorathians' feet. The door to the massive vessel opened, and from within emerged beings that looked nothing like the peaceful creatures the Zorathians were used to. These were the Deathworlders, humans, but different. Their eyes were cold, their movements calculated, and their armor looked like something designed for war, not peace. One of the leaders of the Zorathian Council stepped forward, a mixture of fear and hope in their eyes. You came, they said, their voice trembling. You heard our call. You are the ones who will save us. The human leader, a towering figure clad in black armor, looked down at the Zorathian. His voice was cold and emotionless. We did not come to save you. We came to finish what your enemy started. The Zorathian leader recoiled in shock. What do you mean? We called for help. We are desperate. Our world is being destroyed. Oh, why? Deathworlders' eyes narrowed. Help? You should have known that asking us for help means more than you realize. We don't fight for mercy. We fight to win. And we don't just defend. We destroy. There was a moment of silence, the air thick with tension. The Zorathians had not expected this. They had expected mercy. They had hoped for allies who would bring peace, not destruction. But as the Deathworlders began to spread out across their planet, the Zorathians realized that this was no ordinary army. They were warriors of a different kind. As the Deathworlders prepared for battle, the Zorathians faced a hard truth. They had called for help, but what they had brought upon themselves was total war. The peaceful race of Zorath had made a decision that would change everything. They had no idea what would happen next, but they now faced a new enemy, one that was much more dangerous than anything they had imagined. The Deathworlders were here, and their idea of help was far from what the Zorathians had envisioned. The towering warship cast a long shadow over the Zorathian city, its presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Zorathians stood in stunned silence watching as the Deathworlders began to spread out across their planet's surface. They had expected salvation. Instead, they were confronted with the harsh reality of their decision. These weren't just soldiers. They were predators, and they had no intention of playing by the rules. As the Deathworlders moved, their heavy boots thudded against the cracked earth, sending tremors through the Zorathian people. Their faces were hidden behind visors, but their presence was unmistakable. They were here for war, not peace. And though the Zorathians had called for help, what they got instead was the chilling promise of total annihilation for their enemies, and perhaps for themselves as well. The leader of the Deathworlders, a man whose name was unknown to the Zorathians, surveyed the alien city. His eyes scanned the skyline, noting the vulnerability of every structure, the weaknesses in the defenses, the way the very air seemed to tremble with fear. He had fought in battles that stretched across galaxies, but something about this planet, its atmosphere, its alien ways, made the mission feel different. But there was no time for hesitation. His orders were clear. Destroy the enemy, and in doing so, show the universe what happens when a species dares to ask for help from the Deathworlders. Prepare the assault teams, he ordered, his voice low but commanding. We move in 20 minutes. The enemy will know who rules the stars now. The Zorathian leader, still shaken by the cold response from the Deathworlder commander, tried to speak again. We are not asking for war. We need your strength, your knowledge, your peace. His voice cracked with desperation, but it went unheard. The Deathworlders had no interest in peace. One of the Deathworlders, a woman with a grim expression and weapons strapped across her back, looked back at the Zorathian leader. You don't understand, do you? We don't protect. We conquer. We don't come to negotiate. We come to dominate. She turned away, joining the others as they began preparing their weapons and gearing up for the battle ahead. The Zorathian leader stood frozen, unable to grasp the full scale of what was happening. They had hoped for a salvation that would never come. They had summoned the wolves, and the wolves were hungry. As the Deathworlders moved toward the enemy's stronghold, they were met with resistance from Korath's forces. Their warships, though powerful, were no match for the Deathworlders' technological supremacy. The two armies clashed in a violent storm of laser fire and explosions. Yet, while the Zorathians watched from the sidelines, they saw something terrifying unfold. The Deathworlders fought with a ruthless precision that was impossible to comprehend. They moved like shadows, each step a death sentence for their enemies. There was no mercy, no hesitation, just cold efficiency. In a matter of hours, Korath's forces were scattered, their ships exploding in flames as the Deathworlders advanced. It was a sight that made even the Zorathians shudder. They had never witnessed such destruction, not even in their worst nightmares. The once proud invaders of their world were now nothing more than smoke and rubble, their hopes of victory shattered by the very warriors they had feared. The Zorathian leader approached the Deathworlder commander once more, his voice trembling. You've saved us, but at what cost? We never asked for this. This is not the help we wanted. You've torn apart everything we've known. The Deathworlder commander turned his cold eyes to the leader, unblinking. Your people didn't ask for war, but war is what they got. The universe doesn't offer second chances, it only offers power. You wanted help, and now you see what that means. There is no such thing as mercy in the Deathworlders' code. Only victory. With those words, the Deathworlders turned and continued their march. The Zorathians were left in stunned silence, watching as the war that they had desperately tried to avoid was now a brutal reality. They had called for help, and what they had received was far beyond what they could ever have imagined. What they didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. As the Deathworlders moved forward, a new phase of war began, one that would change the galaxy forever. The skies above Zorath had been blackened by smoke and the flashing lights of explosions. But as the Deathworlders swept through the battlefield, An eerie silence began to fall. The Zorathians, once proud and peaceful, watched in horror as their world was reshaped by the ruthless forces they had summoned. What had begun as a desperate plea for help had quickly spiraled into an unforgiving war that threatened to consume them all. The Deathworlders, though victorious, showed no signs of stopping. Their fleet had reduced Korath's forces to mere ashes, yet they didn't hesitate to press forward, their weapons ever ready, their eyes cold with determination. They didn't care who they fought. They cared only about winning. They had come to end the threat, and they would do so in the only way they knew: total destruction. In the command center, the Zorathian leader watched as the monitors flickered, with reports of the battle's progression. What had started as a straightforward defense against the invaders was now a complete obliteration of Korath's forces, and yet the Deathworlders showed no signs of slowing down. "Why aren't they stopping?" the Zorathian leader demanded, pacing in agitation. "The enemy is gone. Our world is safe. Why do they continue to destroy everything in sight?" One of his advisors hesitated, glancing at the screen before speaking, in a whisper. They don't stop, my leader. Once they begin, there is no turning back. It's not just about fighting. It's about domination. The Deathworlders don't know mercy. They know only war. The leader's hands clenched into fists. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The Deathworlders had not come to save them. They had come to show their power, to remind the galaxy that they were the true rulers of the stars. Outside, the ground shook as another explosion rocked the city. The Deathworlders were now targeting the remaining infrastructure of Zorath, tearing apart buildings that had stood for millennia, reducing them to rubble with no more than a thoughtless swipe of their weapons. The Zorathians had never seen such overwhelming force. Meanwhile, the Deathworlder commander, whose name had yet to be revealed, stood among his soldiers, overseeing the carnage. His face was expressionless, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. His mission was simple: ensure the complete destruction of Korath's forces. And with that completed, they would move on to the next phase of the war, one that involved reshaping the balance of power in the galaxy. He turned to one of his lieutenants, a woman with a cold, calculating demeanor. "We have done what we came to do, but there's one more thing left to be done." The lieutenant nodded. "Yes, sir. It's time to make an example of the Zorathians." The commander's lips twitched into something like a smile, but it wasn't one of kindness. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what he was about to do. Prepare them for what's next. Let them see the true meaning of strength. Back at the command center, the Zorathian leader looked out over the horizon, where the massive warships of the Deathworlders hovered like vultures waiting for their prey. The air was thick with tension, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble with the force of the war that raged on. As the Deathworlders continued their relentless assault, the Zorathians began to realize the awful truth. They had summoned these warriors in their time of need, and now they were beginning to feel the full weight of their decision. The Deathworlders were not here to be their allies. They were here to reshape the galaxy in their image, by any means necessary. The leader of the Zorathians turned to his people, his face a mixture of anger and sorrow. "We have made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice low but filled with regret. "We thought we were calling for help, but we have brought destruction upon ourselves." As the Zorathians tried to process the horrifying realization that they had unwittingly invited chaos into their world, the Deathworlders prepared for their next move. There was no turning back now. The war had only just begun, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Zorathians could only watch as the Deathworlders' fleet shifted positions, preparing for their final act of domination. The Deathworlders had unleashed a storm upon Zorath, and they showed no sign of letting up. The peaceful world they had once known was now a battlefield, and the Zorathians had no choice but to face the full consequences of their fateful call for help. The days that followed the Deathworlders' arrival were filled with silence. The once vibrant planet of Zorath had become a graveyard of shattered buildings and scorched earth. The Zorathians, broken by the destruction and the crushing weight of their decision, had come to realize that the Deathworlders had not come to save them. They had come to reshape their entire existence. Yet, something strange began to happen. While the Deathworlders continued their operations of devastation, their behavior started to shift. At first, the Zorathians thought it was just another part of their brutal plan. They were wrong. As the Deathworlders moved deeper into the ruins, some of them began interacting with the wreckage of Zorath's ancient libraries and temples, places that the Zorathians held dear. The commanders in particular seemed fascinated by the alien artifacts. It wasn't just the weapons or the machines they found intriguing, it was the knowledge hidden within the ruins. The Zorathian leader, still struggling with the guilt of his people's plea for help, watched in confusion as the Deathworlder commander, who was always cold and distant, paused in front of an old Zorathian statue. He examined it with curiosity, touching the intricately carved symbols. "This is art," the commander muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "These beings, so fragile, yet their minds, their creativity, are beyond anything we expected." The Zorathian leader stood in shock, unsure of how to respond. You're fascinated by it?" The commander didn't immediately answer. Instead, he continued to study the statue, his expression softening slightly. "War isn't all we know," he said, his voice quieter than before. "There's something about this world, something about your people's spirit. You fight for survival, not conquest. That's different from what we're used to." It was the first time the Zorathian leader had heard such words from a Deathworlder. His mind raced. Was there a chance, a small possibility, that these warriors were more than mere destroyers? Could they understand the value of what they had just destroyed? But before the Zorathian leader could voice his thoughts, the commander turned sharply, his cold eyes narrowing. "This is not why we're here," he said, his voice like ice. "We did not come for your art or your ideals. We came to finish what your enemies started, and we will do so without hesitation." The Zorathian leader's hope flickered, only to be snuffed out once more by the harsh reality of their situation. The Deathworlders had no interest in peace. But still, something lingered in the air, something about the commander's words, that made the Zorathian wonder if there was more to this war than blind destruction. Days passed, and the Deathworlders continued their ruthless assault on Korath's remaining strongholds. Yet the Zorathians noticed that the commander's actions were beginning to change. He would pause more frequently, his gaze lingering on the wreckage of Zorath's old cities, a hint of something deeper behind his cold eyes. It was as if something, some hidden part of him, was beginning to question the very nature of the mission. But the Zorathians dared not ask. Meanwhile, as the Deathworlders' grip on the planet tightened, another force was quietly stirring in the shadows. There were whispers among the surviving Zorathians. They had been wrong to place their trust in the Deathworlders, but what if they could still salvage something from the ashes of their once peaceful world? The Zorathian leader, desperate to find any way to end the destruction, sought out the few remaining members of his council. Together, they devised a plan, an audacious, dangerous plan, to try to turn the tide of the war. It was a long shot, but it was all they had left. If they could appeal to the one thing that seemed to be holding the Deathworlders back, their sense of honor and pride, perhaps they could make a deal. They didn't know if the commander would even listen, but they had to try. Zorath's fate rested on the razor's edge, and so, as the Deathworlders prepared for their final assault on Korath's last stronghold, the Zorathian leader stood before them once more, a final, desperate hope in his heart. "Will you truly finish what you've started?" he asked the commander, his voice trembling with both fear and defiance. "Or will you listen to what we have to offer? We still have something to fight for, something worth saving." For the first time since their arrival, the Deathworlder commander seemed to hesitate, his eyes narrowing as he studied the Zorathian leader. "You still don't understand," he muttered, his voice colder than before. "This is not about what you want to save. This is about what you deserve to lose." And yet, in that brief moment, something flickered in the commander's gaze, something that seemed almost human. The sun had long set over Zorath, and the once bright planet now seemed shrouded in an eternal dusk. The battle was almost over. Korath's forces were in ruins, scattered across the ravaged planet, their last desperate defenses crumbling beneath the unstoppable might of the Deathworlders. But even as the final victory seemed within grasp, the air hung heavy with uncertainty. The Zorathian leader stood at the edge of the battlefield, his heart pounding in his chest. The Deathworlders had destroyed everything they had known and loved. But something unexpected had been growing within the commander, the man who led the Deathworlders with unwavering brutality. There was something beneath the surface of his cold eyes, something that hinted at the possibility of a different future, one where war wasn't the only answer. The Zorathian leader approached cautiously, his mind racing with questions. "You've destroyed Korath's forces," he began, his voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "But is this the end? Is this the world we must now live in? The ashes of our once great civilization?" The Deathworlder commander stood tall, his black armor glinting in the dim light of the dying planet. His helmet was off now, revealing a face worn by countless battles. But there was something different in his eyes, something softer. He didn't answer right away. Instead, gazing out at the ruins, the smoldering remains of cities that had once been thriving centers of Zorathian life. "This planet was once your pride," he said slowly, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Now, it is a graveyard. And yet, it is not what I came for. War is what I know, but this is something else. The destruction I've caused was necessary for my mission. But now I don't know what's left." The Zorathian leader's chest tightened. Was there still hope? Could they save their world from complete obliteration? Or had the Deathworlders left them with nothing but despair? "I don't understand," the Zorathian leader whispered, his voice shaking. "You came here for war. You promised us victory. But what have we truly gained? Look at our people. Look at the wreckage of our cities. What was all this for?" The Deathworlder commander turned his gaze to the leader, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "You called for help, but you didn't know what that meant. You didn't understand that when you ask for warriors, you get war. And when you ask for us, you don't just get victory, you get a new order. This planet, this galaxy, they don't change without bloodshed." The Zorathian leader's heart sank. It was true. They had asked for help, but they had unknowingly invited the chaos that followed. But then something unexpected happened. The commander's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something, regret perhaps, passed over his face, vanishing just as quickly as it had appeared. He looked away, his voice low. "The war is over, but there is nothing left to rebuild. Your people will have to make their own future. I cannot give it to you. No one can." The Zorathian leader stood in stunned silence. Was this a final act of defiance? Or was the commander finally beginning to see the consequences of his actions? The lines between conqueror and savior were beginning to blur, and the Zorathian leader wasn't sure which path this warrior would choose. Just as the tension reached its peak, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A new force, one the Zorathians had never expected, emerged from the wreckage. A small fleet of unknown ships descended from the darkened sky. These ships were not Deathworlder vessels, nor were they Korath's remnants. They were unfamiliar, alien in design, and unlike anything the Zorathians had seen before. They landed with a force that shook the ground, their engines roaring like thunder. The Zorathian leader turned, his heart racing. Who were these newcomers? Were they allies? Or were they yet another force come to claim what little was left of Zorath? The Deathworlder commander stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his blade, instinctively preparing for another fight. But then, the leader of the new fleet stepped out of one of the ships and everything stopped. It was another Deathworlder, one even more imposing than the commander. His armor was adorned with intricate symbols, his presence undeniable. "I have been watching," the new leader said, his voice commanding, yet calm. "And now, the true test begins." The Deathworlder commander stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "You You're not with us? The new leader shook his head slowly. No, I am not. I am here to ensure that this war, your war, ends before it consumes us all. The galaxy is not yours to destroy. A tense silence stretched between the two Deathworlders. It was clear that a new chapter was about to unfold, one that neither of them could predict. The Zorathian leader stepped forward cautiously. What is happening here? Who are you, and what do you want from us? The new leader turned his gaze toward the Zorathian. I want what's left of this world to survive, he said, his voice resolute. And I want the Deathworlders to understand that war cannot be the answer forever. And so, as the last of the Deathworlders and their enemies stood at the precipice of the future, the fate of Zorath and the galaxy hung in the balance. The final showdown had not only brought victory, but also the beginning of a new struggle. A struggle for peace, for control, and for a future that none of them had imagined.